Hello, BookTube. Alex over at Whatpageareyouon recently made a video called My Favorite Writers, in which he lists his favorite writers, not only the ones that make the cut, but the ones who almost make the cut, or who maybe someday will, or maybe should now make the cut. And he didn't tag me on his video for two reasons. One, because he hates me because I smell. And two, because his video is not actually a tag, but I want to make it one. We have been coy with each other here on BookTube for years. It's time we put our cards on the table. It's time we laid out who our favorites are. Which teams are we backing? So I am transforming this into the My Favorite Writers tag, and I'm tagging everyone in the world. Everyone in the world has to do this tag. We must put our cards on the table. So I'm going to go through it just the way Alex did. We're starting with 6. I think his numbers were random for entries in each category, but now they're carved in stone. So first, the category is not quite. The not quite writers. The ones who aren't quite favorites. You love them, but they're not on the central list. And he listed 6 of those, and so I'm going to do the same thing. And the first of those is the Roman historian Tacitus, who I love. I just don't. You love Tacitus, but you don't fall in love with him. And the second, number 2 on this list, is another Roman historian, Livy, who spent his whole career writing one book, A History of Rome from the Founding of the City. And he finished it, but we only have portions of it. And those portions, some of them are very long, some of them we're lucky enough to have contiguous portions, and they show us what a wonderful treasure trove the whole thing would be. Livy is a bit of an acquired taste. He has some very good translations into English. That's not the problem. The problem is the way he writes history. It's not the way we write history anymore. I myself don't think it's discreditable as a kind of history, but good luck saying that since the German academics got a hold of the genre of history. I love it. History for Livy is a story that he can write himself. He goes into the past. He'll do his best to make sure that he's got rough facts down correctly. But then when it comes to the eve of some famous battle and he has his 2 generals squaring off on the battlefield, he will give them speeches to say, of course he will. No speech of theirs is recorded, so he will just give it to them. Even when a speech is recorded, he will either amplify it or just substitute one of his own. And he also moralizes all throughout. Sometimes it's less heavy-handed than other times. I think that I've long made a case that Livy is far more reliable as a historian than historians tend to give him credit, simply because they look at his storytelling side and think, oh, anybody who's doing this must not care about veracity. But Livy was writing in a very literate time, in a very literate city, surrounded by other historians, who would have made a laughingstock of him if he'd made serious factual errors, and he knew that. I love his book. I wish that some publisher would come out with an enormous 1-volume Arbre Urbe Condita, a 1-volume from the founding of the city that is all the Livy that we have, plus annotations and notes. Instead, you go to Oxford or Penguin, you'll get multiple volumes, and I urge you to give it a try. Give him a try, even though he's on my not quite list. I adore him. The third one on the not quite list is Washington Irving, an American writer, one of the very first American writers to make a job of writing, to be an international hit. He was an international hit. It was the first time that many European intellectuals even thought there was a chance that there could be such a thing as American literature or an American writer. And I know Washington Irving is largely dead now, except for the little shards of his immortality. He wrote The Headless Horseman, for instance. He wrote Rip Van Winkle. And those things will keep him alive. The terrible pity here is that those things are usually all that anybody reads of him. And everything that he wrote is wonderful, including, for instance, non-reprintable works of his that will never be reprinted, like, for instance, his big biographies or his big histories that are every bit as good as any of his, Knickerbocker tales, but are now long gone. Washington Irving is a tremendously interesting figure, and I don't believe he ever wrote anything that was bad, so he makes my not quite list. Another one that makes my not quite list, this one hurts just a bit, is Samuel Eliot Morrison, and a great American historian who, I believe, never wrote anything that wasn't great. He was a naval historian mostly, and that theme runs through most of what he writes, and I can't recommend it strongly enough. I know that it's a long shot, a mid-20th century stuffed shirt historian of the Navy. And all I can say is, give it a try. Give him a try. You won't have to look at many library sales or yard sales. We come across, for instance, his biography of Christopher Columbus, or whatever it is, the maritime history of Massachusetts, for instance. Take some book of his and just give it half an hour. Just spend half an hour in his company and see if you don't see what I mean. I think you'll want to read. I think you'll want to keep reading. I love his writing. I wish that more people did something with it. Most of his writing is out of print now, and there's been very little in the way, as far as I know, unless one of you can correct me, there's been very little in the way of historiography. There's been very little in the way of studying Samuel Eliot Morrison. And am I wrong in thinking that there are no collected letters? There's nothing like that. I wish that weren't true. And as long as we're going to move on to number 5 now, and as long as we're on the subject of mid-20th century historians, I thought I would also include Burnout De Voto, whose name will be known to very few of you, and most of his works, if not all of them, are out of print. I'd be willing to bet that even Across the Wide Missouri or The Year of Decision, the books that sold a lot in his lifetime, I'd be willing to bet that those are out of print. And that's a shame, because he also never wrote a bad book. And his books are, how to describe it? Once upon a time, this guy was so popular that there was a church of Bernie. Once upon a time, when I'm walking the dog and I see a bumper sticker that just has wild hair and a forehead and says Bernie, he's who I think of before I think of the new inheritor of that name. And again, it won't be as easy with Samuel Eliot Morrison. With Samuel Eliot Morrison, at least you have that Christopher Columbus book. Or he wrote a two-volume set of books on exploration, on European exploration of the New World. With Burnout De Voto, it might be even harder, unless I'm mistaken, unless one of his books has a new edition, in bookstores. But what I wouldn't give for Penguin Classics or the Library of America to do him the way it should be done, to do the 3 big books, to do his edition of the Journals of Lewis and Clark, to do maybe letters. He was a fantastic letter writer. So I'm going to include him. He's number 5 on my list of 6 not quites. And the final not quite, number 6, is going to raise howls in certain quarters of book 2. It raised howls myself. Believe me, this is not an easy, this is now a tag. Alex didn't mean it as a tag, but it is a tag now, and it's not an easy thing to do. And if it is easy for you, if you can sit down and just dash all these off, then I think it's high time you re-examine how unthinking your reading is. If this isn't a difficult thing for you to do, then if you're the very top of your pantheon of personal favorites is not constantly under threat, then you might want to re-examine how open-mindedly you read in the first place. But no, number 6 on my not quite is Jane Austen. I know. I love her too. I love everything she wrote. I love some of the things that she wrote to the point of idolatry and beyond. We're talking about your favorite writers here. And keep in mind, that's important. It's not a difference that Alex stressed, because he's not a droning pedant, but I can pick up where he left off in that regard. And keep in mind, we're talking your favorite writers here. This should not be a list of you looking to look good. This is a list of the writers that are your personal favorites. When it comes to that, I love Jane Austen, but she doesn't crack the top 5. She doesn't crack my absolute favorites. Now, in the organization that Alex did for his version of this, his pre-tag version of this, he had his favorites right front and center, right in the middle of the whole video. I want to sort of leave them for last. I think that's their natural place. The next category is sort of like not quite, and that is maybe. Which is, it's another, the not quite and the maybe are just a chance for you to give runners up a little time in the sun. And I want to give you, you get 4 maybes. And I want to give you my 4 maybes before I move on to my favorites. And the first one of those is George Eliot, who is only a maybe because there are a couple of books. No offense to Jennifer, insert literary pun here. There are a couple of books she wrote that are absolute snoozers, and that no sane person would consider the greatest book of all time. But when she's great, she's really great. And it's just a pure sign of the timidness of the market that everything of hers isn't constantly in print. She did a whole bunch of nonfiction writings, a whole bunch of translations. Good luck getting your hands on one of them. It's ridiculous. This is one of the greatest writers of all time. Everything should be in print at all times in multiple editions. The other maybe is Edith Wharton, another author I truly, truly love. But some of the novels were written for cash. Some of them really look that way. Some of them are a little thin. The great ones are as great as great gets, as great as novels in English get. But that's why she's a maybe, because if we were to lose half of her work at random, I wouldn't be sure of the status of the half that was left. I wouldn't. You could stick a pin in her collected works and hit stuff that isn't great. I would argue stuff that isn't even good. For instance, just recently I got a volume of her poetry. But then the third maybe is Alfred Lord Tennyson, a Victorian poet who I absolutely love. I have huge chunks of his poetry by heart. I understand that he creaks a little in the modern sensibilities. I think the modern sensibilities could loosen up a little in that regard. And the same thing is true of my fourth maybe, who is Robert Browning. If Tennyson creaks a little, Browning doesn't creak because he's gone. He doesn't make any noise at all. And that's a terrible shame, because he's terrific. So those are my maybes. We did my not quites and my maybes, and now we move on. You get 5 favorites, and it's time we were frank with each other about who those are, so that we can silently, or even not so silently, judge each other. So we are going to go through my favorites, and I'm going to rank them 5 to 1. I'm going to leave my favorite for number 1. Most of you know what it is already. Number 5 is Mary Mccarthy, which will come as a bit of a surprise to you, that she's favorite and Jane Austen and Edith Wharton are not. But that is, I want to stress the nature of this, now that it's a tag, is that these are your favorites, not the ones that maybe you think are objectively better than the others, or that literary reputation is higher than the others. Mary McCarthy's literary reputation is currently not the best. She is not read. She is not studied. She is largely not favorited by anybody, whether it's her nonfiction or her fiction. That's a terrible shame. She is one of my favorite writers. She is number 5. Then number 4 is one of the only intersections between my video here and Alex's video. Alex's video is mostly full of literary choices who, he doesn't know it, but the one thing they share in common is not their literary greatness. He almost never mentions anybody that has any literary greatness. No, the one quality that they all have in common is how deeply they're going to embarrass him when someone unearths this video in 30 years. But the one place we intersect, aside from Jane Austen, is Virginia Woolf. And Virginia Woolf is my number 4. She is brilliant. Everywhere. Just everywhere. I, of course, favor her nonfiction, but even her fiction, she's one of the only modernists, one of the only gimmicky fiction writers, and she isn't always gimmicky, but when she is, she's one of the only ones that actually pulls it off for me. One of the only ones that seems to be coming from a place of respect instead of derision, both for the reader and for the literary history that suckered her. I don't like it when modernist authors look at that literary history that made them who they are and say, you're junk, I can do better. And she never gives me that impression. And all of her fiction, even the second tier stuff, I just love. Then number 3 on the list of my favorites is the Dutch humanist Erasmus. And if Mary McCarthy's a hard sell, this guy's even harder. He is known now for one work and one work only, The Praise of Folly. It's in the Penguin Classic. It's sometimes taught in schools. It's relatively still alive. No one that I know reads it for pleasure, but it's still relatively not forgotten. And that's an extra irony in the case of Erasmus, because he spent his whole life writing. Like Washington Irving before, or long after him, Erasmus made his living by writing at an age when that was not possible. That was simply not possible. He did. Wrote industriously, all the time. A whole shelf full of letters. Gigantic hardcover volumes of letters, a shelf full of them, all of them educations, a shelf full of great, peppy nonfiction and occasional writing, tons of translations and annotations. He was the world's most famous literary figure. Everyone knew his name. And if you went back in past and talked to any of the literary figures in his day, but also any of the ordinary people in his day, the shopkeepers, the vice admirals, the queens, the kings, the princes, the prelates, if you talk to anybody back then in Erasmus's day and you'd said, in 500 years, no one is going to know this author at all, they wouldn't have believed you. 2 different popes would have excommunicated you. And yet, he's gone. And if you get him in a peppy translation, and there are peppy translations, you will be mystified as to why. He speaks directly to our own current mind frame. He speaks, as one person said tellingly enough in the early 19th century, he speaks with a perennially fresh voice. That is true. And that's no mean thing. Not many people can do that. So he's number 3. Then number 2 is the Roman poet Horace, without whom I could not live. I could not live. I don't say that I couldn't live without his many, many innumerable English language translations. There are quite a few of those I could live without. But him himself, I can't live without Horace. One of the most honest and most immediately human voices anywhere in the canon. So he is number 2. And some of that might confuse some of you who are just new to the channel. If Horace is number 2, then who on earth could be number 1? Well, number 1 is my very favorite author, and that is the Roman poet Ovid, who is most famous today for his long poem, The Metamorphoses, but who wrote lots of other things as well. Both when he was a rising star, when he was a nobody, when he was famous, and when he was in exile and miserable. And all of it is beautiful. Just beautiful. That beauty doesn't always come across in English language translation, but the things that Ovid can do with the Latin language virtually defy description. The only close parallel that I can think of, the only, for instance, Roman figure who comes close is someone who you'll notice is not on any of these categories, and that's Virgil. But Ovid outstrips him. Ovid outstrips everybody. So he is my number 1 favorite in the list of favorite authors. And now you are all tagged. Alex doesn't tag you, but I do. It's time for us to lay our cards on the table. Who are your not quites? Who are your maybes? And who are your favorites? And feel free to tell me about them. This is going to be a great chance to learn and to have reconfirmed some things that I already know. And it's also going to be, I'd be willing to bet for quite a few of you, as much fun as a learning experience as it was for me, to sit down and cut away all the rest of it and just think, all right, who would make my list if I had to make a very short list? So I want to hear it from every one of you. So get cracking. And I will leave you for now, but I will be back. Thank you, BookTube.